They say Napoleon rose like a storm, like thunder cracking through the worn-out ceilings of monarchies, like lightning splitting centuries of tradition. But storms don't rise alone, and lightning always touches something before it vanishes. Before he was emperor, before he rewrote maps and crowned himself with destiny, Napoleon Bonaparte was just a Corsican boy with wild eyes, a sharp tongue, and a hunger bigger than any battlefield could satisfy. He had ambition, yes. He had brilliance, certainly. But what he didn't have, and not yet, was the key to power's locked door. That key wore perfume. That key spoke fluent French in a low, teasing voice. That key wore silk gloves and held a past full of danger and loss. Her name was Joséphine de Beauharnais, but you wouldn't know that from the school books. They barely whisper her name, and when they do, they call her a distraction, a scandal, a barren wife. But what they never tell you is that she built him, and when he betrayed her, she made sure he'd never forget. Let's wind back. Paris, 1795. France is limping through the wreckage of its own revolution. Heads have rolled, literally. The guillotine still smells like blood and fresh ink. Politicians are trembling, and the power vacuum is sucking in every kind of opportunist, from poets to generals to desperate widows. That's when Napoleon meets Joséphine, and she's older, wiser, already a mother, already a widow. Her aristocrat husband had his neck introduced to the guillotine. She survived on charm, wit, and an uncanny ability to make men feel like kings, even as their crowns rolled away. She was no stranger to salons and secret societies. She knew everyone that mattered, and everyone who would. Napoleon, by contrast, was awkward in high society, too intense, too poor, too Corsican. He could win wars, yes, but he couldn't win influence. And in France, influence was the new army. That's why Joséphine wasn't just a lover. She was a political upgrade, a living shortcut to the circles Napoleon could never enter alone. She knew the bankers who'd later fund his campaigns, the politicians who'd give him power, the women who whispered into the ears of men in charge, and more than anything else, she saw what he could become, long before he became it. She taught him how to dress, how to speak, how to flirt without sounding desperate, how to turn ambition into charisma. She gave him her name, her contacts, her home, and her loyalty. And in return, he gave her obsession. He wrote letters like a man possessed, pages upon pages soaked with need, control, and love, twisted through pride. He'd write her from battlefields, promising triumph and demanding devotion. When she didn't write back, he'd rage. When she did, he'd memorize every word. But Joséphine wasn't some naive girl wrapped up in a fairy tale. She played the game, too. Flirtations, affairs, rumors. She kept her own world spinning while he conquered his. And that made Napoleon burn even hotter. Jealousy gave him a new reason to win, to climb, to dominate. He didn't just want Europe. He wanted her to kneel before him, finally realizing who he was. By 1799, the French government was hanging by a thread. Riots, corruption, and fear were everywhere. That's when Napoleon, backed by his allies and sharpened by Joséphine's whispered connections, staged a coup. In one swift move, he became first consul, the de facto ruler of France. And who was by his side that night? Joséphine, dressed in black velvet, standing in the shadows but pulling strings. The generals respected her. The wives feared her. She had become the silent architect of a revolution inside a revolution. She wasn't on the battlefield, but her fingerprints were on every victory. And when Napoleon crowned himself emperor in 1804, literally taking the crown from the Pope's hands and placing it on his own head, it was Joséphine he crowned Empress beside him. He could have chosen a younger noblewoman, a fertile girl to bear him heirs. But he didn't. Not yet. Because despite everything, the affairs, the distance, the power games, He still saw her as part of his legend, the woman who saw the fire in him before anyone else could even smell smoke. But legends are fragile, and so is love. Behind the gold, behind the ceremonies, behind the grand portraits, there were cracks. Napoleon was obsessed with legacy, with bloodlines, with creating a dynasty to rival Caesar or Charlemagne, and Joséphine couldn't give him children. They tried over and over, but time had already chosen her role. She had been a maker of kings, not mothers of them, and no matter how much he still needed her in his heart, his empire needed an heir more. This is where the betrayal begins. Behind closed doors, Napoleon's advisors urged him to annul the marriage, to remarry, to secure the bloodline. He resisted, at first, because she wasn't just his wife, she was his symbol. To divorce her meant rewriting his origin story, admitting that the very woman who helped him rise was no longer useful. But the truth is, Napoleon didn't just betray Joséphine when he left her. He betrayed himself, because Joséphine represented the raw ambition that built him, the loyalty that saved him, the trust that no general could offer. And when he chose power over her, he split himself in two. She knew it before he said a word. She could feel it in his silence, in the new advisors who replaced her friends, in the way her name stopped being whispered in salons and started being erased. One winter night in 1809, he finally told her, not as a man, but as an emperor, cold, formal, like a state decree. The marriage would be annulled. He would remarry. She would no longer be Empress. She didn't cry in front of him. She didn't scream. She simply nodded and walked away. But inside, something burned brighter than all his battlefields. She had loved him when no one else did, carried him through corridors of power he didn't know existed. And now, cast aside for a younger womb and a cleaner reputation, she would become his most elegant enemy. Joséphine disappeared from public view, quietly, no scandals, no threats, no tears for the press. But behind the scenes, she was building something bigger than revenge, something smarter than violence, a legacy of her own, one Napoleon would never see coming. Power changes people, but absolute power, that turns ambition into addiction. And for Napoleon Bonaparte, once he tasted that throne, once he felt the weight of a crown on his own head, not handed to him, but taken by his own hand, there was no going back. He didn't just want to rule France anymore. He wanted Europe, and then history itself. But there was a catch. The moment he sat on that throne with gold wrapped around his ego, he became everything the revolution claimed to hate. A self-made emperor who rose on the blood of kings, only to become one himself. And while the people shouted his name in parades and generals bowed in halls filled with mirrors and velvet, one truth ate at him every night he went to bed alone. He had betrayed Joséphine. Not just by leaving her, but by rewriting their story like she was just a side note, a step on the staircase, the woman who gave him the key to the palace, now locked out of it forever. But Joséphine didn't vanish. She didn't run to another country or fade into tragic exile. She stayed in France, on purpose. She kept their old estate, Malmaison, a sprawling, beautiful home on the edge of Paris, where she had once helped Napoleon plan his campaigns, charm diplomats, and rebuild his image. And now, it became her kingdom in exile, not of soldiers, but of whispers. Because Joséphine understood something Napoleon had forgotten. Influence doesn't always come from thrones. It comes from tables, from conversations, from secrets shared over wine and laughter. While Napoleon was off redrawing maps and marrying an Austrian duchess, Joséphine was rebuilding her own empire, one conversation at a time. She welcomed the wives of ministers, threw parties where generals relaxed and talked too much, let foreign dignitaries wander her gardens and fall under her charm. And all the while, she listened, learned, calculated. She was no longer empress, but she had become the queen of quiet power. Meanwhile, Napoleon's world began to shift. The second marriage, the strategic one with Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, looked good on paper. A Habsburg alliance, a future heir, a cleaned-up imperial image, but what it lacked was soul. Marie-Louise was obedient, dutiful. She bore him a son, yes, but she didn't challenge him, didn't understand the fire in his gut the way Joséphine didn't keep him sharp with clever conversation or teasing glances. She was a symbol, not a partner. And Napoleon, for all his brilliance on the battlefield, started making mistakes off it. He grew paranoid, distrustful, surrounded by yes-men who feared him more than they respected him. He launched campaigns that stretched too far, too fast. Spain became a graveyard. Russia became a nightmare. And every time he returned to France, he saw the ghost of what he'd lost. Joséphine, still graceful, still admired, still more powerful in retirement than most queens in their prime, and he couldn't bear it. In private, he sent her letters again, not the fevered love letters of their youth, but quieter ones, reflective, lonely. He asked after her health, sent gifts, even let her keep the title of Empress in public, as a gesture. But Joséphine never wrote back. Not once. Because she knew something he didn't. She didn't need to fight him to win. He was already losing, one piece at a time. His allies, growing nervous, his enemies, growing bolder, his people, tired of war, of taxes, of promises that turned into funerals. And above it all, Napoleon's own myth, the unstoppable general, the man chosen by fate, began to crack. That's when Joséphine made her move, but not with armies, not with swords, with introductions. She began connecting men who once served Napoleon, but now felt pushed aside. Ambassadors, merchants, retired officers, sons of fallen nobles who had once despised the revolution, but now feared where the empire was headed. She whispered ideas, encouraged letters, suggested meetings, never demanding, always gentle. And in those whispers, seeds of betrayal were planted, because Joséphine knew that every empire breaks from the inside first. She didn't want Napoleon dead. She didn't even want revenge in the bloody, dramatic sense. What she wanted was legacy, to shape the future after him, to build a version of France where her influence lived on, even if her name didn't. And to do that, she had to make sure Napoleon's fall was inevitable. Now, across Europe, the tide was turning. Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria. The coalition against Napoleon was growing stronger. The emperor's control was slipping, his treasury drained, his soldiers exhausted. The moment of reckoning was coming. But what no one expected was that Napoleon's greatest enemy wasn't a king or a general. It was a woman he once loved. Back at Malmaison, Joséphine quietly met with envoys. She dined with men who once carried Napoleon's banner, now questioning whether they'd been forgotten. She guided conversations with velvet gloves, never pushing, only suggesting. And piece by piece, she became the bridge between the past Napoleon built and the future that would replace him. By the time Napoleon returned from his failed Russian campaign, frostbitten and humiliated, Joséphine already knew what would happen next. She didn't gloat, didn't appear in public to humiliate him, but in letters between ministers, in private conversations behind locked doors, her name started appearing again. Not as a lover, not as an exiled empress, but as a quiet broker of peace, a voice of reason, a woman who had power without a title. And Napoleon, he felt it. Every time his allies hesitated, every time a general disobeyed, every time a deal fell apart behind his back, he wondered, was she behind this? The truth? Yes. And no. Joséphine didn't destroy him. He did that himself. But she made sure that when the fall came, it wouldn't be chaos. It would be a new order, one shaped by those who still remembered her grace, her intelligence, her loyalty. She was writing a future, with the same quiet elegance she once used to teach a young angry Corsican how to hold a wine glass in a Parisian salon. And that, my friend, was her real empire. Suspicious content. There are battles that shake the world. There are speeches that echo through centuries. But sometimes all it takes to unravel an empire is a letter. It wasn't written with fury. It wasn't even long. But it carried the weight of a broken oath. And when Joséphine opened it, she didn't just lose a husband. She lost the crown she helped create, the story she had bled to build, and the man she had believed would carry her name into history as his equal. Instead, that letter made it clear. She would be erased. It arrived in the early winter of 1809. A plain envelope, no royal seal, no perfume, just Napoleon's signature, cold and clipped. It was a formal decree drafted by advisors but signed by the emperor himself. It began like any state announcement, in accordance with the needs of the empire, but the truth was tucked in every line. He was ending their marriage, not out of hate, not even for betrayal, but for a reason that cut deeper than any scandal ever could. She was no longer useful. Joséphine had known it was coming. She wasn't a fool. For months, she'd watched Napoleon grow colder, more mechanical, more obsessed with legacy than love. His advisors had been circling like vultures, whispering about heirs and dynasties and necessity. And then came the Austrian Duchess, young, royal, fertile, exactly what the empire needed, and everything Joséphine wasn't. Still, when she held that letter in her hands, her fingers shook. Because it wasn't just a separation. It was the undoing of everything she had helped build. Joséphine had given him more than love. She'd given him access, polish, legitimacy. She was the reason he survived those early Parisian salons, the reason the political elite even considered taking him seriously. While he was still winning wars in Italy, she was winning hearts in France, making sure that when he returned, power would be waiting. And now? He'd written her out with a single stroke of ink. She didn't cry, not where anyone could see. She didn't burn the letter. She didn't even scream. She folded it carefully, placed it in a small wooden box. And then she went to her mirror and dressed for dinner like nothing had changed, because Joséphine knew the story wasn't over. It was just changing chapters. That night, Napoleon summoned her for a final conversation. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even emotional. He laid out the reasons like a general planning a campaign. France needed an heir. The people expected continuity. The marriage had failed in its duty. She listened, eyes steady, voice calm. Then she simply said, "You will regret this more than I will." And she was right. Napoleon never stopped loving her, but he stopped choosing her. And that, in the end, became the seed of his downfall. The public divorce was staged like theater. There was ceremony, a forced show of dignity. Joséphine even read a speech in which she consented to the annulment. But behind the closed doors of Malmaison, she was preparing for something far more powerful than revenge, a rewrite. Because here's what the world didn't see. Joséphine didn't fall apart. She got stronger. She turned Malmaison into more than a retreat. It became a hub. Diplomats from across Europe visited her. Artists painted her. Scientists sent her rare flowers and letters. Foreign royals, even those at war with France, wrote her private notes of admiration. She became a symbol, not of Napoleon's shadow, but of everything he left behind. And through it all, she kept that letter. Not because she missed him, but because it reminded her what power really looked like, and how easily men could lose it when they forget who helped them rise. Meanwhile, Napoleon remarried. The Austrian Duchess, Marie-Louise, gave birth to a son, the long-awaited heir. The empire rejoiced, but the celebrations were hollow, because the Empress didn't light up salons. She didn't know the streets of Paris. She didn't carry the heart of France the way Joséphine had. And Napoleon felt it. He'd gotten what he thought he wanted: a royal wife, a child, a dynasty. But in quiet moments, he found himself thinking about Malmaison, about the woman who'd once matched his ambition word for word, who could make generals stammer and politicians melt, who had taught him to be more than a soldier. He wrote to her again, occasionally, always formally, sometimes with a touch of regret. She never answered, because Joséphine knew the secret Napoleon never learned. Power isn't just about conquest, it's about memory, and the people remembered her. Even the army, hardened veterans who had marched with Napoleon from Italy to Egypt, still called her La Bonne Joséphine, the good Joséphine. She had visited their camps, sent aid to their families, spoke their names in court when no one else would. She wasn't their empress by law anymore, but she was still their empress in spirit, and that's what terrified Napoleon most. Because as his wars grew bloodier and his circle smaller, her shadow only got longer. Then came the turning point. Russia, the march into Moscow, the disastrous winter retreat, the tens of thousands of soldiers who froze, starved, or simply vanished into the snow. It wasn't just a military failure. It was a collapse of the myth. The man who was supposed to be invincible had just led the greatest army in Europe to ruin. And who did the people start whispering about again? Not the new empress, not the boy heir. Joséphine? Because she had warned him years ago not to overreach, not to chase too many crowns, not to think legacy was stronger than love. And now, his empire was bleeding, and she was hosting garden parties with the very diplomats who would shape the future without him. That letter, the one he'd sent her so coldly, now felt like a curse, a quiet echo that followed him through every failed campaign, every broken treaty, every betrayal. He had written her out of his story, but she had written herself into everyone else's. And when his empire finally began to crumble and he was forced to abdicate in 1814, do you know where he asked to go? To Joséphine. He wanted to see her again, one last time, to explain, to beg, maybe, or just to feel that warmth that had once made him believe in something other than conquest. But it was too late. Joséphine had fallen ill that spring, her body weakened by years of stress, silence, and solitude. She died before he could reach her, and with her went the last piece of his humanity. At her funeral, diplomats, generals, artists, and foreign leaders attended. Not because she was Napoleon's wife, but because she was Joséphine, the woman who had once stood beside a man rising to the stars, and kept her dignity even as he threw her into the dark. Napoleon wept when he heard the news, but no tears could erase that letter. It remained in her wooden box, folded, preserved, the document that broke a marriage and gave birth to a queen of quiet power. History has a habit of cutting women out, of carving their names off the stones they helped lay, of trimming the roots from stories that were once watered by their hands. And when the victors rewrite the past, they always keep the generals, the kings, the flags. But they try to forget the women who made those victories possible. Joséphine de Beauharnais was never supposed to be remembered, not by the version of history Napoleon hoped would survive. In his fantasy, the books would say he rose from nothing, conquered Europe with genius alone, took a young empress from royal blood, and left behind a perfect heir. Neat, proud, imperial. But Joséphine, she complicated things. She made it clear that before there was an empire, there was love. Before there was glory, there was need. Before the cannon fire and the silk robes, there was a woman who looked into Napoleon's soul and knew exactly how dangerous it could become. So after she was gone, he tried to erase her. Not in anger, but in control. the same way you cover a scratch on marble or smooth over a crack in the wall. Mentions of her began to disappear from official speeches. Portraits of her in palaces were moved to basements. Courtiers were told to stop referring to her as Her Majesty, even though most of them still did, behind closed doors. When the imperial records were updated to reflect France's new royal family, Joséphine's name wasn't included in the dynasty. Her chapter was marked as closed, but power leaves fingerprints. And no matter how much Napoleon tried to polish the mirrors of his legacy, Joséphine's fingerprints were everywhere. At Malmaison, the estate she refused to give up, she had left a trail of correspondence that would later become gold to historians. Hundreds of letters to foreign ministers, artists, botanists, and exiled nobles, each one revealing the web of influence she continued to spin long after the divorce. She didn't write like a politician. She wrote like a human, thoughtful, warm, strategic, yes, but never cold. And that's what made people trust her. Diplomats told her things they wouldn't tell their own allies. Artists gave her works they wouldn't show in court. Even scientists, obsessed with discovery and ego, shared their latest findings with her first. Why? Because Joséphine had mastered the one thing Napoleon never could, the art of persuasion without domination. Napoleon could command, but Joséphine could convince. And even after death, she kept doing it. When Napoleon was exiled to Elba in 1814, a small island off the coast of Italy, with no throne, no army, and no power, the letters came back to haunt him. European leaders gathered to divide up the map, and some of the very men who had once toasted his victories now used Joséphine's correspondence to outmaneuver him. They quoted her words, referred to her insights, remembered her kindness. She was no longer in the room, but her shadow sat at every table. Back in France, there was another problem for Napoleon's legacy. The people still loved her. Not just aristocrats or courtiers, but everyday citizens, florists who had once supplied her garden, soldiers who remembered her visits to the wounded, women who saw in her a symbol of elegance, survival, and strength. Joséphine was of the revolution, but also beyond it. She could walk through palace halls and market streets with the same grace. And when Napoleon escaped Elba and returned to power for a brief, desperate moment, the 100 days, do you know what he asked to be brought back? Her portrait, not Marie-Louise's, not the one of his son. Joséphine's. He placed it in his chamber, looked at it often. Some say he even spoke to it when no one else was around, because deep down, he knew she had been right about everything. He had traded a partnership for a pawn, and while his generals still saluted, while his enemies still plotted, the only one who had ever truly understood him and forgiven him was gone. But her influence wasn't. After Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo in 1815, when he was captured and exiled again, this time to the far-off, wind-beaten island of St. Helena, he began dictating his memoirs. And that's where something strange happened. In the pages, Joséphine reappears. He speaks of her fondly, calls her kind, loyal, the love of his life. He says the divorce was necessary, but also his greatest regret. He paints her not as a political inconvenience, but as a queen of character, a woman of grace. He knew history was coming for him, and in his final attempt to shape it, he couldn't bring himself to erase her entirely. Because Joséphine had already done something he never could. She built her empire without ever needing a throne. Malmaison, her sanctuary, became a museum of culture and memory. After her death, her children, especially Hortense, her daughter, carried her legacy forward. Hortense became Queen of Holland, and her son, he would go on to rule France as Napoleon III. That's right, Joséphine, the woman Napoleon cast aside, became the matriarch of the next French emperor. So tell me, who really lost that war? Joséphine didn't just outlive the divorce. She outlived the erasure, the shame, the attempt to make her a footnote. She outmaneuvered the history books by becoming too beloved to forget. And even today, if you walk through the halls of Malmaison, you'll see her touches, her paintings, her flowers, her books. Not a symbol of a failed marriage, but of a woman who refused to let one man decide her legacy. She was the ghost that haunted his greatness, the lover who became his conscience, and the woman who, even in silence, took back the empire one whisper at a time. Power doesn't fall from the sky. It shifts, moves, gets traded, borrowed, whispered about in rooms with no windows. And while Napoleon thought the battlefield was where kingdoms lived or died, Joséphine knew better. She understood what every truly dangerous woman throughout history has known. The most powerful empire is built on trust, silence, and timing. After their divorce, Joséphine vanished from official politics. But that didn't mean she disappeared. She slipped into a different kind of arena, one without titles, parades, or battle cries. A world where influence wasn't declared. It was passed in glances, dinner invitations, and letters coded in compliments. It began at Malmaison, the estate she turned into a political greenhouse. To the outside world, it looked like a paradise for artists, gardeners, poets. There were exotic plants, statues, rare birds. Visitors thought they were walking through the peaceful life of a retired empress. But Malmaison was more than a villa. It was a nerve center. Joséphine never screamed for loyalty. She earned it. She welcomed foreign ministers not with orders but with charm. She didn't lecture generals. She listened to them. And slowly, without a single official title, she became the bridge between the old aristocracy, the new empire, and the enemies watching from across Europe. How? Because Joséphine had one weapon Napoleon never mastered: patience. While he galloped across the continent trying to conquer kingdoms with iron and fear, she was cultivating something much deeper. A network of men who owed her not their positions, but their careers, their marriages, even their survival. You see, back when she was empress, Joséphine had saved reputations. She had helped generals keep their pensions, helped widows get land, helped ministers cover up mistakes before they hit the court. And she never asked for credit, just quiet loyalty. And now that Napoleon had thrown her aside, those debts matured. Men who once fought beside Napoleon started visiting Malmaison quietly. Some had been dismissed from their posts. Others grew disillusioned by the endless wars. Some just missed the world before the empire became a machine. They found in Joséphine something the new empress never gave them: understanding. She knew what they needed, not strategy, not orders, just to be seen again. She met with them over long walks, over wine. She let them talk about their frustrations, their fears, their regrets, and slowly, they started listening to her again. Not because she commanded it, but because they remembered who she was before Napoleon betrayed her. And that was her genius. She never asked them to turn on him. She just reminded them how much they had already been turned away. Napoleon was bleeding loyalty at the seams, and Joséphine never had to lift a finger to pull the threads. All she had to do was be there when those threads fell into her lap. One of those men was General Moreau, once Napoleon's equal, later exiled for challenging him. Joséphine had always respected Moreau's mind. When he returned to France briefly, broken and bitter, she welcomed him like an old friend. It didn't take much for him to begin quietly advising Napoleon's enemies in the coalitions forming abroad. Another was Talleyrand, the diplomat whose silk tongue had helped Napoleon negotiate early victories, but later turned icy. Joséphine and Talleyrand had always shared a strange mutual respect, both survivors, both fluent in politics as performance. When Napoleon grew paranoid and began sidelining him, guess who kept hosting him for dinner? Joséphine. And there were dozens more, Merchants, bankers, aides, writers, all part of a web of the discarded. Men who had once sworn loyalty to the emperor and now began sharing intelligence, predictions, and criticisms with her. She didn't lead them, she didn't control them, but she was their mirror, the reminder of what Napoleon had chosen to abandon. And in that reflection, many of them began to wonder, did we follow a genius or a tyrant who broke his own compass? Napoleon never saw it happening. He was too obsessed with legacy, too busy planning his next move, Spain, then Russia, then the rest of the continent, chasing immortality like a man running into quicksand. He didn't notice that men stopped warning him when things were about to go wrong. He didn't notice that ministers hesitated longer before signing his decrees. He didn't notice that even his own brother, Louis Bonaparte, Josephine's former son-in-law, began drifting away. Joséphine, on the other hand, saw everything, and she made sure her children did, too. Her daughter Hortense had married into the Bonaparte family but never lost her mother's sense of strategy. While Napoleon grew suspicious of even his own blood, Hortense remained close to the people, the salons, the culture. She became Joséphine's eyes and ears in the next generation, her torchbearer. And then there was Eugène, Joséphine's son, a military commander with a clean reputation. Napoleon had once loved him like a son, even promoted him. But after the divorce, the warmth turned cold. Eugène stayed loyal, officially. But when Napoleon asked him to march deeper into the Russian campaign, he hesitated. Because his loyalty wasn't just to an emperor, it was to the woman who raised him. The shift was quiet. It was subtle. But it was devastating. And it culminated in 1813 after Napoleon's failed invasion of Russia. His army shattered, his allies panicked. The myth of his invincibility crumbled, and while the world thought Joséphine was mourning from afar, she was preparing the people to imagine life without him, preparing her network to think not like traitors, but like rebuilders. And when the Sixth Coalition, a mighty alliance of Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, and more, pushed into France in 1814, Napoleon was alone, abandoned by those he had trusted, surrounded by those he'd ignored. And behind so many of those betrayals was a woman he once wrote poems to, a woman he once called his destiny. Joséphine didn't kill his empire. She let it starve itself, while she fed the future in secret. When the Allies entered Paris, Joséphine didn't run. She stayed, dressed in mourning black, greeted foreign leaders not like a loser, but like a hostess returning to the center of power. And she reminded them without ever saying it directly, "You may be done with Napoleon, but France still remembers me." Empires don't fall in an instant. They don't shatter like glass. They crack, quietly, slowly, over time. A trusted voice goes silent. A general hesitates. A city opens its gates just a little too soon. And by the time the man at the top realizes it, he's already standing on ruins. In 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte looked out across France and saw the cracks becoming canyons. The army that once marched like thunder now limped, thin and demoralized. The allies he had bullied into obedience had joined forces. Britain, Austria, Russia, Prussia, all once rivals, now united by one common goal: end the reign of Napoleon. Paris was surrounded, and for the first time since his rise, Napoleon had no good move left. He tried to rally, he tried to promise. He wrote to his wife Marie-Louise, telling her to bring his son and flee to safety. He sent messages to his marshals, demanding reinforcements, but his letters were met with hesitation, or silence, because by now they knew something he didn't want to believe. It was over. The people were tired. His soldiers were finished. The men who once saluted him now shook their heads behind closed doors. His empire wasn't conquered. It had evaporated, like fog in the morning. And somewhere in the background, untouched, unshaken, still standing with her spine made of steel and silence, was Joséphine. She had watched it all unfold, not with triumph, not with gloating, but with the cold, calm clarity of someone who had already lived through her own fall and learned how to survive it. While Paris braced for the Allies' entry, Joséphine sat in Malmaison, receiving visitors from every side. Russians, Austrians, English, even Prussians. They walked through her gardens, sat in her study, asked for her thoughts on the future of France, and she gave them her signature answer. A smile, a few well-placed words, and no promises. Because Joséphine knew, true power isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's just the only voice people trust when the shouting stops. When Napoleon finally abdicated in April 1814, the news hit like a cannon to the chest of the world. The man who had crowned himself, who had once stood taller than kings and popes, now stood alone, stripped of everything. No more title, no army, no throne. The Allied powers allowed him to keep the title of Emperor as a mockery and sent him into exile on the island of Elba, a small speck of land off the coast of Italy, a kingdom of rocks, olive trees, and memories. And yet, before he left France, before the ship carried him away from everything he'd built, Napoleon made one final request. He wanted to see her. Not Marie-Louise, not his son, not his generals, Joséphine. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe he just wanted to look into the eyes of the only person who had ever really known him, before he became a myth, before he became a monster. Word was sent to Malmaison, and Joséphine, always the strategist, didn't answer right away. She waited. She thought about all the times he'd ignored her, dismissed her, replaced her. She thought about the letter, the cold ink, the formal rejection, the betrayal, and still, she agreed to see him, because even queens have unfinished stories. On a rainy April morning, under gray skies and whispering pines, Napoleon arrived at Malmaison. He didn't come in uniform, no medals, no sword, just a coat, damp from the rain, and the weight of 1,000 regrets clinging to his shoulders. She met him at the entrance, dressed in dark silk, simple, elegant, untouchable, and for the first time in years, they were alone. No guards, no advisors, no applause, just a man and a woman who had once ruled the world together and broken each other along the way. The room was quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He looked at her and saw the ghost of his younger self in her eyes. The fire that once lit his path, the voice that once made him believe he was more than a soldier. She looked at him and saw a man no longer made of marble, but of ruin. The silence stretched, and then finally he spoke. "You were right," he said. She didn't answer. "About everything." Still, she said nothing, because she didn't need to. He had come here not to talk, but to confess, to apologize without the words, to stand before the only person who had loved him before the world did, and admit that he had ruined it all. They talked for a while, softly, about old memories, about their children, about how the world had changed. And then, as the rain began to fall harder, Napoleon reached for her hand. She let him, but only for a moment. Then she pulled away, not out of anger, but because it was already too late. He left Malmaison that evening, alone, back to his ship, back to exile, and he would never see her again. But that final look, the quiet, unreadable stare she gave him as he turned to leave, followed him for the rest of his life. Even on Elba, even in St. Helena, even when the winds howled outside his prison windows and his dreams turned into regrets. That look haunted him, because in that moment, Napoleon saw everything he could have been if he hadn't betrayed the one person who believed in him before anyone else, not his soldiers, not the crown, not the maps. Her, Joséphine, the woman who had once whispered in his ear and made him believe he was a god, The woman who had stood by him when he was just a name no one could pronounce. And the woman who, in the end, took back her crown, not with revenge, but with silence, strength, and that last look. That said, I remember who you were. Do you? Legacies are strange things. They don't always belong to the loudest, the strongest, or the ones who wrote the laws. Sometimes they belong to the ones who were supposed to vanish, the ones erased from portraits, crossed out in ledgers, and footnoted in history books. But Joséphine de Beauharnais, she didn't vanish. She became something bigger than the throne. After Napoleon's final goodbye at Malmaison, Joséphine didn't celebrate. She didn't throw a victory party or draft a memoir full of revenge. No, she returned to her gardens, walked among the roses, watched the world change quietly from behind the silk curtains of a villa that had once been the heartbeat of an empire. And that's what made her different. While men measured their legacy in borders and battles, Joséphine measured hers in memory. She understood something even Napoleon never did, that history is written not by the victors, but by the survivors. And she had survived everything. The guillotine had taken her first husband. The revolution had taken her status. The empire had taken her crown. And still, there she was, hosting foreign dignitaries, planting rare flowers from every corner of the world, watching her children rise, and that's where her quiet empire began. Because while Napoleon's bloodline crumbled, hers blossomed. Her daughter Hortense, the one Napoleon dismissed as emotional, became Queen of Holland, smart, savvy, loved by her people. And her son from that marriage, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. The boy no one thought would matter. The boy who grew up under Joséphine's gaze, who heard her stories, who saw how a woman cast out could still hold court in exile. That boy became Napoleon III, not by war, not by birthright, but by outlasting every man who underestimated him. Joséphine's grandson, her legacy, her revenge. Because while Napoleon's empire was built on conquest and collapsed under its own weight, Joséphine's empire was built on roots, family, memory, relationships she had cultivated in whispers and letters, not cannonballs. She died just weeks after Napoleon's abdication. Some say she was heartbroken. Some say she caught a chill while entertaining the Tsar of Russia. Others say she simply knew her part of the story was complete. But before she went, she left the blueprint. The letters she wrote during her so-called exile, they became guides to future diplomats. The portraits she commissioned hung not in shame, but in palaces across Europe. A reminder of what true grace under betrayal looks like. Her style, the way she dressed, the way she spoke, the way she moved through rooms like music, became the standard for European elegance for decades. And her children, they carried her strength into every room they entered. Her son Eugène, loyal to France until the end, became a model of nobility in Bavaria. His descendants married into royal houses from Germany to Sweden. And her daughter Hortense? She made sure her son, Napoleon III, understood one thing above all. Power means nothing if people don't remember you with love. That was Joséphine's secret. And that's why, to this day, when you speak her name, it echoes louder than any of Napoleon's generals. He may have built an empire of iron, but she built an empire of memory. In the 1850s, when Napoleon III took power, one of his first acts was to honor his grandmother. He restored Malmaison, reopened the salons she once filled with thought and laughter, recovered letters, diaries, jewelry, reclaimed her story from the shadows. Because he knew. The Bonaparte name had only survived because Joséphine gave it dignity. She wasn't just the first Empress of France. She was the first one who mattered. And yet, most history books still treat her like an accessory, as if she was only relevant because of who she married. As if her story ended the day Napoleon signed that letter. But we know better, don't we? We know she didn't just survive a betrayal. She outlived it. She rewrote it, and in the end, it was Napoleon who became the tragic figure. The brilliant fool who had everything: love, loyalty, a woman who would have died for him, and threw it away chasing a myth. She, on the other hand, she had nothing but grace, and ended up with everything that lasts. The world will always remember the emperor. But the soul of the empire? That was hers. So the next time you hear a story about Napoleon, ask yourself, why do they never mention the woman who taught him how to rise? Why do they skip over the Empress who kept France together while he tore Europe apart? Why do they treat her like a footnote when she was the final author of his legacy? Because that's what betrayal does, friend. It tries to erase you. But if you're Joséphine, you don't fight back with fire. You fight back with roots, elegance, and memory. And in the end, you win.